Thank you very much for the interview. First of all, my question is about the existing assumptions. So now it's already the 40th day, actually it's a 46th day since the beginning of Russian invasion in Ukraine. So what could you say, like what are the main previously existing assumptions this war changed on local or on international level of politics? And also considering the fact that a lot of social scientists could not foresee or failed to foresee what was about to come.
Look, there are so many assumptions that are actually challenged that I don't know even from where to start, but yeah, I mean, I've been following some discussions about why the social scientists who actually studied the post-Soviet politics for many years, they were regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine as very unlikely. And is it the fall of social science analysis, while the CIA and MI6 were like predicting the Russian invasion and leaking the warnings to the media since the end of October, in the early November last year. The paradox is actually that the intelligence, which was also not universally correct, and we know that European intelligence didn't forecast the invasion, particularly the French intelligence. So it's not about generally the Western, but specifically US and UK, CIA and MI6. So the paradox is that they forecasted the war, but they were grossly wrong about the potential of Russian army, and which they overestimated, and as grossly wrong about the potential of Ukrainian army, which they grossly underestimated. And they forecasted publicly that Kiev would be taken in 3 or 4 days, which happened to be totally wrong. And that's a question, of course, or at least they wanted to project such forecasts publicly, because they complemented a lot with apparent Russian miscalculations about how easy and successful would be their so-called special operation in Ukraine, which, as many people believe, they regarded would be almost like greeted with flowers and not meeting any serious resistance. So it's if we are speaking about what social scientists got wrong, social scientists were actually not so much wrong about how this war would actually go on, and what would be the huge consequences for Russia, for Ukraine, obviously, and for the whole world. And that's why so many real experts on post-Soviet politics regarded it as very unlikely, because this war is creating so many risks, including for Putin himself, that now it's not exactly clear how he's going to survive them. But yeah, if he would be capable to survive the very uneasy developments on Ukrainian battlefields, with like some already apparent defeat near Kiev, which Russian army retreated, leaving like hundreds of civilians dead, and the sanctions, the isolation of Russia. So if Putin would be able to survive this would mean like an immense change of Russian political regime into more stable, more consolidated, more constitutionalized, very repressive for some groups, but at the same time more kind of like hegemonic for other groups, which Russian elite would try to buy loyalty, because you just cannot rule on sheer dictatorial measures and coercion for a very long time. At some point, they would need to start buying loyalties of Russians who would start feeling the effects of the sanctions and the decrease of their living standards. And we also need to remember that the main source of Putin's legitimacy in Russia was the narrative that he brought back some stability to Russian lives after the collapse of the 1990s. The people supported him because he was like a figure who brought some stability and affluence in their lives. And now his disastrous war in Ukraine brings something opposite back. So the effect of the initial rallying around the flag, which happens perhaps during most of the wars, it's not forever. And so at some point, they would need not simply like drawing the Z letter, which means nothing, actually, but starting buying loyalties and promoting a kind of like more coherent imperialist conservative project, ideologizing the regime and giving Russian political regime more kind of like mobilizationist features. I would say it's perhaps transforming the ruling party into more kind of a real party than it was before, or starting a pro-Putin massive movement in support of the war. So different institutions that would mobilize active consent and would try to inspire the enthusiasm about the war among the Russians, especially if this war would not be finished in the next months, but would prolong for this year and for the years to come. That would be a huge challenge. And as we now see, some of the perhaps disgusting parts of this possible new Russian ideological project would be like an idea that they would need to kind of like forcefully re-educate many Ukrainians from a wrong anti-Russian identity, which they regard Nazi or Banderovit, to a kind of like more acceptable to Russian Ukrainian identity, Malros, little Russians. And yeah, that's of course this basic implications of how not only Ukrainians will now see Russians, but now how the whole world is seeing Russian actions in Ukraine and the emerging narrative about genocide.
Speaking about the main narrative of denazification that Putin has used as a primary justification framework for invading Ukraine, well, one could say that this hugely problematic part about Ukrainian authorities supporting extreme far-right for years was successfully used by Putin's regime for the framework of action. But it has gone farther, as you said, and it has somehow essentialized, right, as this kind of a Nazi narrative. On the other hand, Putin's regime itself is pictured as fascist. And consolidating fascist regime, we are hearing from a lot of commentators, and we got the situation in which somehow both parties are actually blaming each other, to put it in a very simple terms, for the same thing. And now, unlike some societies like Germany, for instance, where they have a very strict and very kind of a specific understanding and conceptualization of fascism and Nazism, I feel like this, in many societies, like in Georgia nowadays, for instance, this situation leads us to the moment where we're losing the tradition of common understanding of these concepts, like the tradition that was established in the Second World War and afterwards. So how do you think one could somehow think of this problem or tackle this problem if that is possible?
I don't know how we are going to do with this, but I completely agree with you that fascism and Nazism are turning into completely empty signifiers to be manipulatively used for any purpose right now. And what we could do during the time of war and highly intense emotions, especially in Ukraine, especially in Russia, at this moment, the debates about some of the complicated issues are just completely impossible. Whatever you would say would be kind of like used against you, and it's just turning meaningless to debate to which extent Russian regime is transforming into a kind of like a new fascism, or what was the actual role of Ukrainian radical nationalists in Ukrainian regime. So even raising these issues would is turning into completely meaningless debate. In some other countries, perhaps it could be easier, but I see that the European public sphere is transforming, the US as well. And the first thing to do is stop the war. After stopping the war, a more meaningful and more nuanced discussion will be possible.
In your writings, you are discussing the post-Soviet condition as a condition that was difficult to characterize and difficult to find some kind of commonalities, given the constant crisis of political representation. Something what you call this kind of absence of legitimacy of the political elites that have acquired their wealth and property through some sort of uncontrolled privatization and all these processes that the societies went through economically after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But then you're also suggesting that somehow that depending on how the war will end, this will totally change the situation in the region and especially in this space. So can you elaborate a little bit more on this?
Yeah, that's right. That we and it's not only me, it's also my co-author Oleg Shuravyov, Russian sociologist. We analyzed the post-Soviet condition as a perpetual crisis, and that's why it has always been so difficult to define what's exactly is post-Soviet beyond saying that this is simply something that is after Soviet. And some people expected democratic transition. They are, I think, they're now massively seen as naive, just in the light of the war, for example. Other people were expecting consolidation of regimes like Putin, Lukashenko, and Nazarbayev. But we see that perhaps Putin might have some prospects, but we just recently seen that the regimes which were perceived as like consolidated dictatorships, which were ruling the countries for 20, 30 years, Lukashenko since the mid-90s, Nazarbayev started to rule Kazakhstan even during the Soviet times, they were shaken to the fundament with the recent uprisings, which they were capable to survive, first of all, because of Russian help. And without Russian help, it could easily turn into another post-Soviet revolution, like also recently happened in Armenia, which was also an unexpected revolution in the light of some of the political scientist theories, which explained the success of revolutions in Ukraine, 3 in the life of just one generation, or very frequent changes of governments in Moldova, with the split of national identity that allowed mobilization of the opposition, which split the elites, which delegitimized the ruler almost by default to a large part of the country. But Armenia was always seen as a kind of like quite a monolithic society, consolidated by a memory of a genocide. And Belarus was also capable to withstand many previous attempts to do something like in Ukraine, and which were always very marginal, but not in 2020. And Kazakhstan didn't even see perhaps that level of oppositional protests before the actual armed uprising in just 2 months or 3 months ago. This were very, very unexpected, and that also challenges this assumption that those authoritarian regimes that emerged in the post-Soviet space would be some kind of stable formations. But this may actually be now changing because of the war. So one of the outcomes would be if Russia is defeated, and that would likely mean just the end of the post-Soviet space. I mean, on the ideological level, in Ukraine, it's just completely evident when the ideological narratives which survived the Soviet collapse about the victory in the Second World War over the Nazis, about the Russians and Ukrainians as brotherly people just collapsing as an obvious reaction to the brutal war that the Russians started. But that would also mean political reorientation of post-Soviet elites towards either the West or China, as I would expect in Central Asian states. And the whole political spectrum would be reoriented towards the alliances with the structural alliances in the political partners, new hegemons. Or the second major scenario would happen if Russia would withstand this, the consequences of the war, and that would mean a fundamental transformation of Russian political regime that would indeed may get some of the features that would be tempting to call fascistic. Stronger ideology, mobilization, stronger repression, but at the same time attempts to buy loyalty of the part of the proper population with the use of very harsh repression against other social groups or even subjugated nations. It may happen in Ukraine if Russia would be able to occupy a large part of Ukraine. So that would be also the end of the post-Soviet ambiguity, and a new consolidated sovereigntist regime claiming to be on a par with the Western powers, with China, and with the imperialistic ambitions, which would be only strengthened as a result of the war, and may have other very dire consequences.
Speaking of imperialist ambitions, and especially of Russian imperialism, nowadays there is a lot of discussion, particularly within the left, about the Russian imperialism on one hand and how it changed or evolved throughout the war, or how war probably demonstrated it, and on the other hand the US hegemony. Do you think that this war actually had a particular effect on understanding these terms, and also that you think that how we approach them also defines significantly the political strategy of social forces around?
Yeah, it's obviously changing, and now we see a huge of interest to the notion of Russian imperialism, which has been really under-theorized So when we speak that Russia is imperialistic, what exactly do we mean? Beyond that, Russia started a brutal war on Ukraine and has some plans to install a puppet government, or maybe even annex part of Ukrainian territory. But how exactly does it work with the established concepts of imperialism, particularly the Marxist theories of imperialism?
Perspective of imperialism.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So, is it really useful to to analyze this war as some reflection of Russia finance capital expansion to capture the markets and so on and so forth, as Marxists analyzed the First World War and the war preceding to it in that way, because the fact is that the Russian foreign policy has been actually damaging for Russian economy. And that's what we also see as the result of the sanctions. But it was also clear after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Before 2014, Russian economy was actually growing, and one could actually make an argument, as Russian political scientist Ilya Matveyev, that before 2014, before Crimea, there was actually a combination of political and economic expansion. And Russia's attempt to get Ukraine into Russia-led international institutions, the customs union, particularly with Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, which then transformed into Eurasian Union, could be seen as actually at least partially economically driven, not simply with some idea about Russian world and other ideological narratives. But I mean, what happened after Crimea was kind of like this junction between what could be profitable for Russian capitalism, which did not profit from so much from Crimea annexation or from supporting the war in Donbass, and what the Russian government was actually doing. And now we see a reproduction of the same pattern. Putin is doing something evidently damaging to what at least a large faction of Russian ruling class would likely prefer, not just losing their property accounts and possibilities for investment and trade with the Western countries, but actually continuing to exploit these opportunities. But now this is changing, and one of the outcomes of the war could be, but not necessarily, but it's potential that there would be a strengthening of kind of like national sovereignist faction in the Russian ruling class against the comprador, or pro-Western, and there would be more interest in not only reorienting from the West towards China and the countries of the global South, which is not that easy, but also the reorientation toward the internal market in Russia. But we would need to see to which extent that would be actually possible. I mean, the discussion of Russian imperialism is, of course, super important. But the point is that it should not be used as another label, and not just to turn it completely meaningless, as we've just discussed what happened with the fascism and Nazism concepts, which actually had very clear cases behind and and some very long history of conceptualization and analysis, but now are turning into just ideological labels to use simply for completely outraging manipulations. So the concept of imperialism in case of Russia there is a huge need for conceptual and research work on the level of Russian economy, on the level of Russian politics, and of course on the level of Russian culture. But now we see mostly the focus on Russian culture, on claims that we need to decolonialize it and that we need to reassess the whole history of starting from Pushkin, who was kind of celebrating the Russian conquest of the Caucasus, and ending, of course, with the most obvious things that are now reproduced in Russian official media about wrong Ukrainians. At the same time, we also need to forget about other imperialisms that are not negated by the case of Russian aggression. And despite the left has actually have been spoke a lot about NATO expansion, the actual analysis of the contradictions of the NATO expansion, why they were not actually inviting Ukraine into NATO for so much time. What was exactly standing behind the resistance of France and Germany to inclusion of Ukraine, and why US in 2008 during George W. Bush administration was so interested in getting Ukraine and Georgia to NATO and pushing forward that very unfamous statement that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. So there is some, let's say, mainstream analysis, but for the Marxist analysis, for the left analysis, there's not so much actually done behind the reproduction of the cliches. And that's only the NATO dimension of Western imperialism. What about the economic dimension? What are the economic interests of the EU in Ukraine, US in Ukraine, and the analysis of the EU association agreement that was particularly done by Ukrainian left, that showed that that agreement would be not really beneficial for Ukrainian economy and would have some damaging consequences specifically for more advanced and more higher added value segments of Ukrainian economy. It's not appreciated, but now it's not simply some small left in Ukraine, but even people in Ukrainian government and Ukrainian business have been raising the question of why this agreement is so beneficial for the EU, but not actually profitable for Ukraine. What are we actually winning from that? And this economic dimension is hugely underestimated in relation or discussion of the Western imperialism in Eastern Europe, and should not be forgotten. Because all the focus is now on what Russia is doing in Ukraine.
Right. No, I completely agree with this under-theorized state of Russian imperialism, especially among our societies. But I again fear that during the wartime, somehow the public discourse is not open for discussing such matters, because one way or another you can be labeled in a very kind of harmful ways, which can be whatever, but still it seems like the first priority is now that the war has to end, right? And then maybe we open this discussion much farther. My last question, so considering this absolute priority of ceasefire nowadays in the given moment, how do you see the possible end of the conflict? And still in this situation, whether or not can we talk about the best scenario, so to say, of the end of the conflict?
Look, at this moment, we are at the stage that anything is possible. The nuclear war is possible. And I mean, when I was, for example, at the start of, after the start of the war, I was warning the people that at some point, if Putin might not allow himself to lose in Ukraine, and if he would be saying that some major defeat is coming, that would actually mean that he may lose power and also his life, he may seriously starting to blackmail the world with a finger over the red button, waiting for Biden to call him that, okay, Vladimir, let's talk like Kennedy and Khrushchev in the 60s. So when I was saying that could be regarded as like some speculations, but recently this was said by Karaganov, who is one of the major expert ideologues of like close to Kremlin. And he said almost exactly this in his recent op-ed in New Statesman, I believe. That sounds even of course, even scarier. So this is a doomsday scenario. Yes, there are kind of like second worst scenarios is actually turning Ukraine into a kind of like Afghanistan that some people in the West are a little bit too enthusiastic about. Let's turn Ukraine into Afghanistan. Russia would lose Ukraine as they lost Afghanistan and as the US lost Afghanistan. But what is it going to mean for Ukrainians? How many more Ukrainians are going to die? How many more cities will be destroyed? And what does it mean if your economy would be bombed into some pre-modern stage with all of the major industries destroyed and the major infrastructure destroyed? So that would be like the second worst disaster for Ukraine after the nuclear war, which would be the disaster for the whole humanity. And there are other like bad scenarios, partition of Ukraine, if Russians would be able to occupy a large part of the territory, proclaim kind of like a puppet regime, or they may even annex parts of Ukraine. And it would negotiate a settlement, which at the moment may not be the likeliest scenario, but that's exactly what they're discussing in Istanbul between Ukrainian and Russian delegation. But we also need to understand that the ultimate decision about that, whatever they're going to discuss in Istanbul, the ultimate decision will be made by Putin. And that would be his choice, either to accept some of the compromise options, which, for example, at this moment would mean that Russians would need to leave from the occupied southern Ukraine, Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts. And they don't really look like they're going to leave, because now they're introducing ruble in those regions. They started to pay some amounts of money to the pensioners, to the public sector employees. There are signs that they are going to install kind of like occupation administration in those regions. So it looks like they are going to stay there for quite some time. And that's, of course, makes the prospects of peace less. And of course, the revelations about further massacres of civilians, like happened in Kiev suburbs, are not exactly the things that bring the peace settlement closer. So at this point, one of the things that I've been telling since the start of the war, that actually the clear prospects of EU membership for Ukraine would help Zelensky to present even difficult outcomes of the negotiations as a victory for Ukraine, because Ukraine would not only concede on something. But Zelensky would be able to claim that Ukraine won something. The Ukraine won European perspective that quite many Ukrainians were struggling since 2014. And that would make the settlement more stable and more popular within the Ukrainian society. That would be clear to explain what we have been actually struggling for. But that, of course, depends on the European elites, first of all, and to their agreement to give Ukraine massive help, support for Ukrainian state institutions, which would be very important to prevent the quite expected outlash at the people suspected in collaboration with Russia, with the people who were speaking the oppositional dissenting views before the war. And the improvement of the human rights situation will be also more feasible with within the framework of European Union. So that is, of course, perhaps the best possible scenario at this moment. But yeah, we need to be very sober that it's not the only and perhaps not the most likely scenario which Ukraine is facing now.
Yes, we can only hope for peace now for Ukraine and for the world. So thank you very much.